Hello, this is Craig Camp, and welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deeply into Demeter Biodynamic and Regenerative Organic certified wine growing and farming at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley. This is meant to be a podcast for those that aspire to, as the Regenerative Organic Alliance says, farm like the world depends on it. These interviews will be focused on our work here at Troon Vineyard, but will also include the work of other farmers committed to regenerative agriculture. And now for today's interview. I asked our winemaking team of winemaker Nate Wall and assistant winemaker Micah Wagner to dig deeply into their philosophy of winemaking. And dig deep they did. This is the first of 3 extended podcasts where Nate and Micah discuss standard, modern winemaking and contrast it with our minimalist, non-interventionist biodynamic winemaking at Troon Vineyard. Ask winemakers to talk about winemaking and talk they will. Originally conceived as a type of April Fool's spoof of commercial wine additives, this discussion naturally evolved into a more serious discussion. So these are long, complex, and decidedly geeky podcasts that we hope you will find as interesting and fun as we did. This episode, part 1 of 3, focuses on general modern winemaking and white wine production. Episode 2 will discuss common techniques of red wine production in today's cellars, while Episode 3 will compare and contrast how we make our wines at Troon Vineyard compared to most other wineries. So get comfortable and dig into modern winemaking and then how we make our wines at Troon Vineyard.
Hey, I'm Nate Wall. I'm the winemaker here at Troon Vineyard.
And I'm Micah Wagner. I'm the assistant winemaker here. And we are going to walk you through the various winemaking styles, philosophies, and choices you have throughout the winemaking process today.
Yeah, so as by way of introduction, I kind of want to underline the point that somewhat different than a lot of other beverages, like wine is absolutely an agricultural product. So there's a reason why we continue to talk about the vineyards and the terroir and the locations it's from. It's because, it is absolutely tied to the place it's grown. And that's what's so fascinating about wine and this whole world of wine is how many differences can exist even within the same grape grown in different regions. But the point here is that as an agricultural product, there's a lot of inherent variability in this product. Everyone has kind of heard of the concept of vintage variations. So even at the same location, year after year, you can have differences brought on by a changing climate. Even more so today with kind of more flashiness, right, in those changes. Dramatically hot or drought years followed by like cooler or wet years. But like even in more calm settings, just differences of like, was it a warm spring? Was it a wet spring? Like when did you have bud break? Like, did you have a heat event at different points of the year? Like how did the growing season progress? And there's a million different things that can lead to slightly different outcomes in those grapes every year. So, this variation is something that can absolutely be embraced. It's what is exciting about wine, but it also does lead to those variations, and there are different methods you can take as a winemaker to either kind of enhance or lean into those variations, that variability, or to try to bring wines into more of a consistency, like year after year, to try to mitigate, I guess, some of those swings. And so that's part of what we're going to discuss today. And a lot of what I would call conventional winemaking, which is basically winemaking that has been taught to winemakers over the past like 30, 40, 50 years, even 60 maybe years. A lot of the goal of conventional winemaking is often to try to get towards like minimizing some of that variability, to try to have more consistency. And there's various like methods and additives and approaches that can allow you to have that consistency.
Yeah, so the point of our conversation today, we are hoping that it's both interesting for the average consumer as well as other winemakers or just people in the industry and interested in wine. because for consumers, this is a great chance to get a little more curious and ask more questions about what's in your glass. And then for winemakers, maybe you can learn about new strategies today, or kind of start questioning why you're adding a certain product when you do, if you can make wine in a different way, if it would taste better, if it would maybe enhance your vineyard practices. So we're not here to say what is right or wrong, or that there's a best way to make wine. In fact, Nate and I have both made wines in a variety of ways over our careers. So we've shaped our philosophies after quite a bit of work. And Nate has made a really beautiful project here at Troon. So, we have a standard that we uphold, but there is a spectrum of winemaking. It's not black and white. And we're here kind of more to dive into different options people have, and common products that we see and have used in the past. And then also talk a little bit about intention and, why people do what they do with their wines.
Yeah, and so to Micah's point about what we're so lucky here at Troon Vineyard is that we are an estate vineyard, and the importance of kind of the vineyard first approach really can't be understated. And a lot of the reason we can do what we do or what we don't do here, as we'll get into, is based on our farming practices. And not just our farming practices and our vineyard management, but starting even earlier than that, the proper site selection and grape selection for our site allows us to make wine the way we do, and the ability to each year reassess what worked and what didn't work, and then the next growing season have the opportunity to address any shortfalls in the vineyard, which allows us to do less in the winery, which is ultimately our goal. So an example of this is, and this is pre-industrial winemaking basically, is this way, is the importance of grapes and site selection. I mean, that's why France famously doesn't really tell you what grapes are in a bottle of wine, right? It's all about the region where it's grown, and that's because in France they codify into law what grapes can be grown where, and the importance of grapes grown in that region is because they found that over time having a certain selection of grapes allowed them to kind of counteract some of this variability we were talking about. So Bordeaux, there's the kind of famous 5-6 grapes that people know in Bordeaux. Rhone, which we're much closer to that, has a lot more grapes, 16, 17 red and white grapes. But the point here is that some years certain grape varieties do better and others do less well, and the next year that might flip-flop. But by having this diversity of grapes planted, you can actually resolve a lot of this climatic variability. Even, and this is in France, obviously this is centuries ago. I'm not even talking climate change variability. I'm just talking vintage variability. You can do that through the proper grape selection and then through blending, through being able to kind of have this where the strengths and weaknesses of different varieties kind of synergistically blend together to really make a wonderful final product. So. And that is kind of, at Troon, we have 20 different grape varieties planted. And that is one of the large reasons why is having such a diverse selection of grapes allows us to also kind of embrace that vintage variation, that climatic variability, allowing some grapes to do better. Some years we might have more Syrah, some years less Grenache, so our blend will ultimately have more Syrah and less Grenache in it, or it could flip-flop the next year, but having all these different options allows us to use less interventions perhaps in the cellar, and then to use blending as a tool to address some inherent variability that goes into all agricultural and all farming products.
Yeah, and we'll walk through some different styles and options of winemaking, but in addition to just the philosophy of the winemaker and what they're interested in creating, there are a lot of other things to consider as well. So, the size of your winery, how many cases you're making, how much money you have to spend, your budget, how much labor you have. So there are a lot of decisions that, even if you go into a vintage as a winemaker thinking that X, Y, and Z are going to happen, there's a lot of surprises along the way and a lot of factors and variability in size of winery and staff. And so that's something to consider as well. So should we dive into it?
Yeah. So I guess what we want to talk about now then is we'll start talking about white winemaking and what it takes to make a white wine. And we wanted to start with just a brief overview of what the main steps in making a white wine is. And then we'll run through that, and then we'll go through kind of step by step and talk about a lot of the decisions that are made as a winemaker in each of those steps. So I would say, obviously all winemaking, the most important decision almost any winemaker ever makes is right at the beginning, harvest, when to pick the fruit. So really, although you could make an argument that the winemaking process actually starts far earlier in the vineyard, but for our purposes, we're going to start the winemaking process.
We'll keep it to winery today.
with the picking of the fruit. And so, the fruit is picked, and the next step is the fruit intake into the winery. For white wines, then the next step would be the fruit processing and going to the press. So white wine is made from the pressed juice from the grapes. So this early step here is pressing the grapes. There's then a settling and a racking off of the lees after that pressing. That's followed by fermentation. With white wines, there's a possibility of a malolactic fermentation. This is something that is pretty much universally performed with red wines, but in white wines, that's definitely a stylistic and or stability question that we'll discuss in a minute. Following the end of fermentation and or malolactic, you then have like an aging, and like kind of both the aging and the vessel, like in the management of the aging there. Followed by possible blending decisions and trials, stabilization for white wines, in particular like a cold and a heat stabilization, and then ultimately there could be some filtration involved here, and then bottling. So that's a very brief overview of the steps, and now we'll just go into detail about those.
Yeah, great outline there. So yeah. Starting with step one, the harvesting. No matter how you're going to make your wine, you do need to pick the grapes. So we are lucky here at Troon. Obviously, we have our estate property. All of our fruit is picked and brought right to us, not far from any of our blocks. We also want to point out with all of the winemaking practices here at Troon, for all of these steps, and anyone making natural or low intervention wine, cleanliness is super important, just because we are not working with any, or I'll say as many, backup plans. We don't have the availability of a lot of products or high doses of sulfur. We want to do the best job possible at mitigating any problems before they start. So cleanliness is super important. We're picking on pH here and then not adjusting with sugar or tartaric acid or anything. If you were working at a more conventional winery, do you want to talk about some options they have at this step?
Well, yeah. So, to kind of continue on the picking decision aspect here, Micah mentioned, we definitely prioritize pH, and we'll explain just how important that is in several steps of the upcoming winemaking process. I think it's probably more typical for white wines in particular to pick on both Brix and certainly so Brix is a measurement of sugar, and certainly flavor. Obviously, we're not just picking on pH. We're not just looking at a number when we're making our picking decisions. But we do prioritize pH, which is a measure of the acidity of the wine. Want to throw this out here because sometimes this gets confusing. A wine that has a low pH, so like a pH of like 2.9, 3, 3.1, that's considered low. A low pH wine means it's a high acidity wine. So pH 7 is neutral on the pH scale. Technically, anything below 7 is acidic, but wine pHs are generally within the 3 to 4 range. So anything down at the bottom of that, like high 2s and low 3s, that would be considered, a low pH wine and meaning pretty acidic, whereas a high pH wine would then have lower acidity. So it's an inverse relationship. Just wanted to clarify that because sometimes that's confusing for people. But so those picking decisions, if by picking with pH, what that allows us to do, and we're going to get into some of those changes, but one of the most commonly used additives in all winemaking, I think, is acid additions. So in many locations, and especially with a warming climate, because there's a relationship, the warmer the year, the more basically acidity you lose in the grapes as they hang out in the vineyard. So the hotter the year, the less acid will be in those grapes, which is exactly why we prioritize looking at that natural acidity for our picking decisions. If we pick at the acid that we know leads to balanced wines, then we do not need to manipulate that. We do not need to add any additional acidity. But if you're looking, more specifically at bricks, which is often related to the development of different flavor compounds too, like the higher the bricks, often the flavors shift along with the sugar being accumulated. But then you are also if you're only looking predominantly at bricks, you're probably losing a lot of acid, and the very first thing you're going to need to do would be to add some acid. Tartaric acid is the primary acid found in grapes naturally. So tartaric acid and malic acid are the two main grapes in wine grapes. And two main acids found in wine grapes. And so tartaric acid is the acid of choice. It's a more stable acid. We'll talk about acid stability in a little bit. But so instead of picking on bricks or flavor, which can lead to a certain style of wine, we decide to pick on pH, which is more to allow, with our philosophy of a minimal intervention, it allows us to basically bypass that first addition that is often made at most wineries, which is an acid addition.
I'll add to that too. Thank you for bringing up that we do also taste. You'll hear us say this a lot, I think, in our winemaking. We do want to run numbers on things, and, obviously wine is an art and science, and so you do need to measure the bricks, measure the pH. We even have a chart of kind of ideal numbers to hit, and most wineries do, right? So they're looking for a certain bricks and pH, as Nate mentioned, but that stylistically is kind of comes more into play. You can choose how you're picking, right? And pretty much every winemaker, if it's possible for them, they're going to be running numbers and tasting, or they're going to have maybe a viticulturalist, a consultant, someone out there also tasting, because even if you run the numbers and they say a certain thing, sometimes that's either they come back different the next day or different than expected, or sometimes you just straight up get the wrong number, especially at a place that's a little bigger. We're a smaller property here, but you could send somebody out to pick a bunch of different things and maybe they mix up bags. So you really want to make sure that that very important decision of picking and when to do so is properly done.
And again, as in the state winery, we're very lucky that we can literally just
Yeah.
walk outside the door and we can be to any of these blocks within a couple minutes. Whereas, some of these decisions are definitely complicated by distance. So like wineries that are purchasing, large amounts or all of their fruit, and bringing it in from different corners of the state or even neighboring states, that can be much more difficult, just logistically for them to be able to like sample and taste and make decisions in the same way. And I guess going back to this, like all of this is just the ideal situation. This doesn't even factor in the difficulties of scheduling a picking crew and actually getting things picked when you want. But like these are all kind of like targeted, the most desirable scenarios. But so still at this picking decision though, there are actually some other things that can sometimes be done like before the winery or before the grapes even reach the winery. Sometimes, especially what I was mentioning, the grapes that need to travel further, they might do a SO2 addition, like actually in the vineyard, just to protect that fruit as it travels sometimes long distances.
And by that, he's saying put SO2 in the bins that they're being
picking
picked.
bins, yeah. That has some complications, and particularly SO2 combined with sugar, and of course when you've got the grapes, you've got a lot of sugar there, so it's not ideal. And what is pretty exciting from my perspective is recognizing this. What's becoming more common is people are actually adding some non-Saccharomyces yeast sometimes, like in the vineyards, to kind of start this protective. In the bins, in the picked fruit bins.
Sorry.
Yeah, they're not sprinkling.
Clear, just
they're not
in case
sprinkling it across
is...
the vineyard. Yes. Okay. Good point.
Once picked and in bins.
Once picked and in bins or in gondolas. Depending on the scale of the operation. Because that is a natural protectant. So, we talk about yeast. We'll be talking about yeast a lot in a little while here, but there are the most common yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that is like the wine yeast, but there are a lot of non-Saccharomyces yeast. We actually have a whole lot of them here at Troon. We have, part of our biodynamic process is encouraging this vitality and this diversity in our microbial, basically our vineyard microbiome, both below and above the soil. So we're lucky that we, again, naturally have a lot of this present. But for people who are unsure or whose farming processes perhaps are more aggressive and actually lead to, the destruction or do not allow for the proliferation of some of these non-Saccharomyces yeasts natively, you can purchase these now as an additive, and sometimes those are being added directly into that picked fruit before it even comes to the winery to allow a certain level of protection of the grapes.
Yeah. So I think that that kind of covers what we had as a first step, which is essentially picking the fruit, your harvest day. And then we go into fruit intake, which, as Nate mentioned, we're very lucky to have all of our fruit right here on property, but sometimes there's the step of actually driving the fruit somewhere. You're going to weigh it out, whether it's your fruit or at like a custom crush facility or wherever the fruit is being taken, just because tax purposes, but also you want to know how much you have, right? And for those of you adding certain things to your juice and wine, you want to know at what rate you need to calculate, especially for tartaric acid and some other initial adds. So that second step is going to be that you're actually receiving the fruit. And then we go into our next step, which is fruit processing, which typically is pressing. We also kind of wanted to note that sometimes with white wines, people can either do like a maceration step, foot tread. I don't know if you want to talk about some other methods or things we've done in the past here.
So once the fruit is landed in the winery, and since it's white, we're going to press it to get the juice, because you want to, white wines are made from fermented white grape juice for the most part. the questions then are: do you do anything before or during the pressing cycle itself to either improve that juice or to alter kind of how that press cycle is going to work? So as Micah mentioned, we actually do some foot treading here oftentimes, which means the fruit is still in the picking bins, and we will tread the fruit directly in those picking bins and then allow it to basically macerate, or just quote soak on its skins for some period of time, depending on like what we're hoping to happen.
What would that do?
Right. And so during that time, even in white grapes, a large amount of the aromatic compounds are actually found in the skins. And, this is definitely true for aromatic varieties, but true for many white varieties as well. And so by allowing this time where the skins now have been broken open and the juice is in contact with the skins, it allows for a little more extraction, perhaps, of some of those aroma or precursor compounds. So other things that are in the skins that later the yeast can use to stick together to kind of make some of these aromatic compounds that we appreciate in the final wine. That can be liberated by allowing these skins to soak on. First, it could be an hour, it could be 4 hours. It kind of depends. It's a winemaker like educated guess, based on probably trials you've done in the past.
And tasting as you go.
And tasting as you go, like seeing how things are changing. With that, there's also, though, just to kind of more conventionally, this would be a time where you could consider different enzymes. So we'll probably be talking a bit about enzymes. And an enzyme, as you probably know, is just anything that basically like accelerates a process that would probably happen anyway. An enzyme is an accelerant in some ways, and all living creatures have tons of enzymes in them for all sorts of metabolic reactions. And grapes have a whole bunch of enzymes in them as well. If you want certain processes to go even faster, you can purchase these kind of purified or distilled or just concentrated enzymes and add them depending on what process you want to happen. So for pressing, for example, this is a time where people might use press enzymes to what that could do is in a white wine making scenario, you could increase the amount of free run juice by adding something. So let's say when we mean free run juice, we mean the amount of juice that, like, after you load up the press and you start it up, like how much juice comes out under like very low, no to very low pressure of the press. Like, so how much is basically, running out of the press before you're really even starting the press. And the idea is that free run juice generally has like lower amount of solids and might, it's often perceived to have more desirable qualities. So maximizing free run juice, which would then be minimizing what you would consider press or hard press juice, which might have more extracted quantities to it. So in white wine, so something else that's in the skins, of course, even in white grapes, are tannins. In red wine, that's obviously beneficial. We want those for structure, for mouthfeel, for assisting with color stabilization, all sorts of things. But in white wines, too much tannin extraction can lead to like a bitterness, especially in a chilled white wine, that the cold enhances that perception of bitterness on the back palate. So, you might want to be, you certainly want to consider how much tannin you may be extracting from a white wine and what effect that might have on the final wine. And conventionally, one way of kind of getting around this is by adding an enzyme that kind of pushes it starts breaking up the grapes, basically making that juice easier to extract so that you have a higher amount of free run juice, less amount of pressed juice. Without the fear of getting higher tannin levels. So that's one reason why a conventional system may want to do that. It also reduces the amount of time you're in the press. So in terms of like a time is money, using an enzyme can speed up that process and allow you to press more fruit in a day but that's the decision you have to make. Are you wanting to add these enzymes to allow for these reactions to happen or not? To be clear, at Troon, we do not add any of this. We do not add, any press enzymes. We didn't add, if in case I was unclear, we don't add anything earlier in the field. We don't add any non-Saccharomyces yeast. We don't add any SO2. But as I also mentioned, we often, a lot of these things do also occur naturally. Like the non-Saccharomyces yeast are present naturally. These enzymes are present in the grapes. Oftentimes, it's just a matter of time.
Yeah. And being that we were under 70 tons this last year, we did get one day where we managed to do 6 press loads in one day, which was a very day and night, I should say. But most of the time, especially with all of the different varieties that we have planted here at Troon, things can line up pretty well to where we don't really have to push to use a certain thing and speed up a process. We want to let everything naturally occur here. But again, Nate touched on it, and I mentioned in the intro, sometimes say you're at a facility and maybe you're custom crush. So it's like, you have all these different clients that want to pick on the same day. And so they're all trying to get onto your schedule within the same day. Well, you could kind of figure out like, all right, how much time do I have? How many staff do I have? What does their product need to turn out like? So you could kind of experiment with different things and possibly be able to make it really beneficial for your program and for your clients. So then the next step would be settling. So once you press your fruit, however you may do that, it goes into a vessel. It most often is going to go into a tank because it's pretty easy to be able to just put all of that juice into one tank. Different people do different experiments at this point too. So, like when I was at Rossi, for example, we would do a de-juice tank. Then we would do a middle press fraction basically. And then there would be a light press and a hard press. And so you can figure out stylistically here what you want to do. Sometimes people put everything in one tank. So for example, if you only have so many grapes and you're not even sure if the press will actually sufficiently press out all of the juice, then that's probably just going to end up being like one barrel. And so you can kind of figure out how you want to divvy things up if you want different press fractions. But what we do is press into tanks. And we let that settle for 24 to 48 hours without adding any additional product. Nate is not really concerned with oxygen exposure. I don't know if you want to go into more detail about that, but sometimes people will also use a lot of dry ice at this step.
That's true, yeah. So, and especially with white winemaking, it seems like oftentimes people are at one side or the other in terms of like oxidative or reductive processes with their wines. And what winemakers mean when they use those words is if they're oxidative in terms of their white wines, they're actually encouraging oxygen exposure like early on in this process in the juice stage. The extreme version of that is like what's sometimes called like black Chardonnay or something like that, where you're like aerating the juice to it turns really, really dark because you're oxidizing, like a very like dark brown, like almost black sometimes, because you're oxidizing all these compounds that could be oxidized. But the point there is if you do this in juice before the fermentation has happened, that's going to settle out, and then later on you can have a much more stable wine throughout the process. The exact polar opposite of this is very reductive white winemaking, which is where you try to exclude oxygen from that juice and fermenting wine at almost all steps, and that generally starts right away at the press, where you would use even a press that is like it's a sealed press that only has like these small kind of juice bars, so that the juice only comes out in a very small area. It's very easy Like Micah said, you can use dry ice even to protect it as it's being put into a tank. You're going to sparge that tank with CO2 or with nitrogen, or you're going to try to remove all the oxygen from the tank it's going into. And so it's these two extremes, and we are kind of happily in the middle of those. We have what would be considered an oxidative press. Like our press is slotted, so the juice kind of comes out of half of the press at a time. The other half is the bladder that pushes against basically like the colander that is the press, squeezes the juice throughout. And what we do then is we taste the juice throughout that press cycle. And as Micah said, you oftentimes might want to make a decision on a press cut, like that whole kind of free one light press to hard press thing that we were saying. It's like, depending on the juice, depending on the year, depending on 1,000 other things, we can make a cut and put and kind of direct some of the juice, the free run, and some of the light press to one tank to settle, and maybe the harder press towards the end of that press cycle to a different vessel to settle, and then we'll ferment and treat those wines kind of separately throughout their lives. But now that we're onto that settling stage, so we just use an ambient settling here. So we don't use temperature control, and as Micah said, 24, 36 hours. We allow settling, and what that's basically doing is just giving time for everything that's not juice to settle to the bottom of the tank. So little bits of grapes, seeds, any little bits of stems, like whatever else came through the press, even though the press is trying to filter that stuff out. Like there's a little screen that tries to keep that out, but you'll always have little things, and you give it some time to settle.
Using a juicer, and then if you were to juice something and leave it in your fridge, it's kind of a good visual of just that separation of there's going to be some stuff at the bottom. So that's essentially what we're doing. We want to rack off the juice.
And thanks for using the fridge analysis. So what is often done here, which we don't do. So but there's inherently, so if you want the settling to happen faster, you put it in the fridge. And in this case, that means you use temperature control to chill down that tank to allow a more efficient, a quicker settling. But that temperature control comes with two costs. And one of it is a literal cost. Like you're using a lot of electricity, right? It's, liquids are, it takes a long time for them to heat up and a long time for them to cool down. So it takes a lot of energy to swing the temperature either way. And if you do decide to use all the energy to cool it all down, guess what? When you want to ferment it, you're going to have to use a bunch of more energy to heat it back up so that you can start the fermentation.
I will give one tip too. If you're using dry ice, there's another benefit. It's going to cool it down too.
There is, however, it does take a lot of dry ice, and if
you have not seen how much dry ice I've used.
I know, but if you compare the cost of dry ice to the cost of electricity, I think you will quickly find
you can maybe find a balance, right?
I think there's a balance there. Well, as in all things, all of this is a balance. Like you said, it's not a spectrum. You can go on either side of this. But so temperature and using cooler temperatures is one way. Once again, there's other enzymes that can assist with settling and clarification. So another choice could be made at this point to add an enzyme that would, and importantly, this enzyme actually works better at ambient or warmer temperatures than it does at cold temperatures. So the choice of an enzyme addition in this case actually prevents you from using all the energy to cool down and then heat back up, and it also improves the settling time, speeds that up quite a bit. But or the approach Troon takes is, we carefully, like I said, we do our press cuts to get our free run, which is already less turbid. There's less turbidity there, less to settle out in general. And then the hard press is treated separately so that if that needs more time to settle out, we just give it more time to settle out. Again, enzymes kind of make something that's going to happen just happen faster. But if you have the ability to wait for it and let it happen, it'll oftentimes happen in a similar, maybe not identical way. Once you have the settled wine, other things that often happens here is sometimes, again, to aid that settling, is bentonite. So particularly if you're well, if you're going to use enzymes, you certainly are going to do that first because bentonite will deactivate those enzymes. Or you can use bentonite, which is a clay particle that it coagulates things. So it makes small things stick together, which then makes them heavier, which makes them settle to the bottom of the tank faster. Oftentimes with white wines, depending on the turbidity, depending on the type of grapes, like some grapes just famously have much higher turbidity. I'm thinking Pinot Gris here, really high. Whereas some, like Chardonnays and stuff might have less, might need that less.
And with this too, we're probably going to say this a million times, but it's not black or white. There are a lot of choices here, and both with what you get back in numbers and then also just what you're tasting and stylistically. I've worked with a lot of different people where it's like you're trying to hit a certain target, right? And so you're going to use a meter to actually show you how much product you need, what to add, when to add it. Then you can actually rack off of these lees, which is the whole point of the settling period. And then you could even add back some lees if you need to hit a certain target.
In terms of turbidity or whatnot.
Yes.
Because if you've over-clarified something, it can actually be problematic for fermentation. Like too clear juice is its own problem as opposed to too cloudy juice. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there are a lot of things. If you do make slightly the wrong move, you could always correct. Always keep your lees just in case. But there are many ways to go about this, and essentially at Troon, I don't think you've had any issues in any vintages prior to just racking without adding anything. All right, and then so at this stage, once you rack off the lees, you still have juice, right? So this is pressed juice. We're probably on day, 2, 3 now. And right before you ferment is when you're going to want to take a sample, and you can maybe have an in-house lab, or you can take a sample to a lab that you trust nearby, depending on how much time you have.
Or because this is a couple days later, you may have taken that sample into a lab 24 hours ago, right? It's not changing
possibly,
a lot to get your chemistry.
Yeah, with white wines too, because we were talking about this when preparing, it's easier to get an accurate, dependable number faster because you're pressing out juice, right? And so all of that juice is going into one tank. You don't have to worry about the cap
variability
of a red ferment and actually waiting a little bit to make sure that when you measure the sugar and acid, it's correct. It's a correct reading. So once you have numbers you can rely on, what some people do is if they want to change the pH, they would add tartaric acid at this point. They might want to add water to adjust the alcohol. Sometimes sugar can be added if you want to raise the Brix. So there are a lot of things you can play with at this stage before you start your fermentation. I would say that tartaric acid is probably the most common add. You do sometimes see water or sugar, but again, the goal with picking decisions, that first intake of fruit on harvest day, is that you're trying to find the perfect numbers. That's the ideal scenario, right, for a winemaker. But a lot of the time, people kind of have to choose, okay, I can't get the pH and the sugar at this perfect place at the same time. So then we just had a conversation with someone last week that they were saying, it was easier to add a little bit of sugar because they really loved the way, if they're picking based more so on pH, they would rather not have to add any tartaric acid and maybe adjust the sugar. So again, this is just based on that winemaker's style, preferences. For us, we do pick on pH here at Troon, and then we're not making any adjustments like this. We're not making any adds at this stage.
Yeah, and what I think is so interesting about the winemaking process, right, is so there's just hundreds and hundreds of decisions for each wine, but your choice at one decision point then affects what choices you're even allowed to make at the next one, right? So it just kind of like, so fundamentally, because we're picking on pH, like we don't need to make the choice of adding tartaric or not. Like that's why we already made that decision. That was our picking decision. But if you're not doing that, if you're making a different choice at picking, well, now you have other choices you might need to make here to adjust what was maybe out of balance in your earlier decision. So with each step in winemaking, one decision could either force another decision or could prevent you from taking an action that you maybe didn't want to. And so just in trying to maintain the intention, like basically go as far back in the process, as early in the process as possible, to make the best decisions for you so that you're not forced into later decisions that you don't want to have to make, right? And that's, as we started this whole thing, we are so lucky to have an estate vineyard where we try to make almost all of these decisions in the vineyard, so that we basically end up not making these decisions in the cellar. But there are, as we've been saying, many reasons why you might make some of these decisions in the cellar. Troon is lucky to not have to make virtually all of these decisions. Once you've got your settled juice now, if you adjusted the chemistry, that's there. Now you're going to rack it off of that lees, and you're going to go into the fermentation vessel. So at Troon, we use, for our white wines, almost exclusively, we use a lot of like old neutral French oak barrels. And by old and neutral, I mean like 5 and 6 year old barrels are like kind of new for us. So especially on the white side, those old barrels, for us, a barrel leaves our cellar when it is no longer airtight, like when it no longer seals up. Typically that top stave, it's called the bung stave, the stave, oak stave that has the hole in it. That's the one that might start cracking or push up or basically just not get tight enough, so that you have a good seal in that vessel. Once that fails, we get rid of them. Otherwise, we hang on to them because, we're at this stage, we're looking just for a place where this wine can ferment and possibly age. We'll discuss that in a second, but we aren't looking to add any flavor, which in some ways you can also almost consider, I do consider, the use of new oak as an additive. It's a wine additive. You are adding flavor to the wine that is not in the wine. So that is an oak additive. We also, though, have at Troon multiple other fermentation vessels, which we find pretty exciting and we've talked about at length before. But in particular, concrete is a fun one. We have both on the white side, we have a concrete egg as well as a dolium, which is basically an upside down egg. Both of those are used in our white winemaking program. There's similarities and differences between the use of oak and or neutral oak, I should say, and concrete. Both of them are porous vessels. There's some oxygen and kind of exchange that's happening, as opposed to, say, a stainless steel tank, which is impervious to gas exchange. The concrete is very thick. It's very insulating. There's very few temperature changes in a concrete vessel. Oak wood is also fairly insulating, especially it's being kept inside a temperature-controlled cellar. So there's some similarities there in terms of the vessels you had.
Yeah, I was going back to the barrels. I mentioned already how clean and careful we are in the cellar, but I just really want to add to this step. We're careful about where we're sourcing barrels from. We know they clean and sanitize them very well. We do the same. We have a protocol once any, I'm doing air quotes, new to us barrel arrives from off of our site. And so we're really careful. We'll touch later a little bit about, issues you can have with barrels and Brett, but essentially for most of our white wines, they're going into barrel almost immediately and being inoculated. They're spending a lot of time in there. They're going through malolactic fermentation.
Well, we're not inoculating.
they're starting their fermentation process and living in these barrels for a while. So we want to make sure that nothing is going to stop the fermentation or cause off flavors, aroma to this wine. So we're being extra careful in that regard. So then we're kind of on it already, but this next step is fermentation,
where the magic happens.
Graduation day, basically. So now the yeasts are going to be converting the sugar to alcohol during this stage. We, as Nate just said, we do not inoculate. We rely on what comes in on the grape skins. We want to be really careful with that too, because I didn't realize this until recently, but sometimes, winemakers say like, oh, we use natural yeast, and we had a question recently that was like, well, where are these coming from? It's like, oh, they're on the grapes already. So we are not inoculating anything, but one could choose a variety of yeast strains to inoculate, as well as a lot of products to get your inoculation all the way from point A to point Z.
Yeah, so I guess one terminology thing that comes up, some people use the term like native ferment. I've always preferred the term spontaneous ferment because that's just descriptive. Like native implies like what exactly is happening. Spontaneous just means I didn't add anything, it just started fermenting. So I use the term spontaneous ferment. But again, like I mentioned earlier, when we were discussing non-Saccharomyces yeast, another benefit of like our biodynamic farming is we are encouraging this microbial diversity, this microbial health in the vineyard, and yeasts are included in that. We've talked about on many of these podcasts, like our composting program as well. Jumping to the end for a minute, like all of the quote winery waste, all of the skins and the stems and everything resulting from the fermentation process, the lees oftentimes themselves goes back into our compost. That compost is not technically, it's a biodynamic compost, which means it's a lower temperature for a much longer period of time. Instead of 15 days of high temperature, we're talking like a year-long process to create ours. And what that really results in is what I would call a bioreactor. It's like a perfect situation for the growth of like healthy and beneficial bacteria and fungi that we then spread throughout our vineyard. And that includes all of the yeasts and things that just came from our winery. So like those are not being sterilized in our compost. They're actually like everything that fermented our grapes last year are getting put into that compost and then spread throughout our entire vineyard. So in some ways we are almost inoculating our vineyard with the previous year's like happy, successful ferments, right? So I mean, to us, we almost could maybe use the term native ferment, but I still like spontaneous. Point is that at this stage for fermentation at Troon, they're in their vessels, and we simply wait for that fermentation to start spontaneously. And depending on the year, depending on the temperature of the cellar of the grapes, that could take shorter or longer, but for us, anywhere between 2-3 days and 5-6 days is how long it generally takes before our fermentations start moving. During that time, we might use a little bit of CO2, a little bit of dry ice, less so in our white winemaking than in our red, but that is a protective technique that we can use to just prevent strangeness. A lot of the basically a lot of what we consider spoilage in winemaking often are aerobic organisms, so they do need oxygen, and by supplying carbon dioxide early on, you kind of prevent the proliferation of a lot of those things. And then by the time the yeast comes around, they're going to start generating CO2 themselves. That's a byproduct of fermentation. And so as the fermentation kicks off and gets going, it basically kind of protects itself against some of these other like spoilage, or just even if it's not spoilage, if it's just not non-benign or just not preferred growth.
Yeah. So just to be clear too, in case anyone's listening, the CO2 he's referring to, it's being added, barrel by barrel mostly. There's a little bit of headspace in them. So we're leaving a little bit of room because we're going to be fermenting that juice. And if you fill the juice to the very top, once it does start fermenting, it's going to be spilling over. Yeah. So there's a little extra headspace, little room in the top of the barrel. And when a when a juice has not started fermenting yet, you want to protect it with that CO2. And so we use that dry ice.
Well, so let's get back to the yeast, right? Because you mentioned yeast selection, but I think that we need to talk about it just a little bit more, because when you get these catalogs from like enological companies that are selling you stuff, like sometimes almost half of that catalog can be yeast. Like it's the amount of selection of yeast is like amazing. There are so many. And it's actually kind of fun to like read through. Like each yeast that you come to is like even better than the last one you just read about. Like, the yeast, like, this one did all these amazing things to the wine, but this one does that and like solves like tension in the Middle East. Like, I mean, these yeasts will bring about like world peace and like love and happiness and stuff. They're the most amazing things ever. But they're super varied. And I guess it's also important to note that pretty much there's not a whole lot of actually truly GMO yeasts used even conventionally in winemaking. Most of these yeasts were basically selections from spontaneous ferments in different parts of the planet, different wine growing regions, that they're like, hey, that tastes really good. I wonder if we can figure out what made it taste that good. And then they start isolating these yeasts, and they grow them up in the lab. They do like little tests with like little like batches of wine to figure out which ones they like the best. And they're like, yeah, like let's market this one. This one's great. And so a lot of these yeasts were all just isolated from spontaneous ferments, which kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Like all this stuff is actually present for the most part, especially in like a living like system full of vitality, like biodynamic regenerative farms are. We haven't done anything to disrupt or destroy this, so they're there. And that's right. But pre-industrial, like before we even had the chemicals to do that, like everything was spontaneous, right? So as we moved away from that, they realized, hey, with the advent of a lot more chemical use in farming, that's when we started having more trouble with fermentation starting. They're like, okay, we need to figure out a way of selling people yeast to have healthier ferments. But in so doing, they also found, hey, we can basically have this total menu of yeast that can really change the character of the wine just based on yeast selection, because they have all sorts of different metabolic activity. I mean, just like, think of yeast as different breeds of dogs, right? Like Chihuahuas and Doberman Pinschers and, Border Collies. Like all those dogs are bred for a very different reason, and they do very different things. Like yeasts are like that too. They're, for the most part, they're Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but there's actually a couple like similar, like Saccharomyces. There's like some Bayanus. There's other similar strains that can also be used that have slightly different metabolism as well, particularly with how they deal with sugars, glucose versus fructose, things like that. But so there's a lot that you can kind of gain from like looking through those catalogs and reading about the yeast.
Yeah, there are quite a few different types. I actually had a lot of fun working at a few places that did a lot of trials. And so, you'd intake however much fruit that would go into one lot of juice, and we'd break it up into 6 different barrels, and they would try, 3 yeasts, 2 on each barrel. This can help people that are using yeast kind of experiment and see what works best for their vineyard. And as Nate was mentioning, different ones go best with certain varietals or have a certain flavor profile. So depending on what you're looking for, you can choose what it is you want. And also navigate that, harvest to harvest. For us, we really prefer to showcase the terroir of our property, and that seems to work very well for us. I prefer to do that here more than anything.
What's interesting is there's actually a lot of science that shows that terroir, what we consider terroir, like the taste of a sense of place, is largely microbial. And that, like, when you look at wines, particularly wines that are spontaneously fermented from different regions, when they have similar characteristics, it appears to be that that's because they share a similar microbiome, and that there's actually kind of almost like these native, now I'm using the word, but these native yeasts in this area, and that gives a lot of consistency to, like, that gives those wines a certain sense of place. And with all of our farming, like, we want you to really taste our sense of place here, which is why we've made the choice of using those spontaneous ferments to try to have that local yeast populations.
And no matter how you're going about fermentation, the goal here is that you want to completely ferment all of that sugar into alcohol, because eventually it's going to go into bottle. And so you'll learn as we go kind of other steps that will happen if there were to be residual sugar, but that is the goal. And so you're trying to get one population to be happy and established and be able to completely ferment everything. So we were discussing this yesterday, how, when we talk about adding a yeast, or maybe you're doing a pied de couve, however you're starting that yeast, or naturally letting it occur, it sometimes gets taught as like a very basic thing, and people will just say, okay, well, you're feeding the yeast, end of story. But really, there are a lot of populations that can come in on this fruit and coexist. And so you want to make sure that one is being set up to survive and do the job you need it to do.
Yeah, so I guess before we continue with that, you just briefly brought up pied de couve. That process is kind of interesting because it's kind of like, in some ways, it's almost in the middle of spontaneous and inoculation, because you're basically, so a pied de couve is something where you can set up, it's oftentimes just you go out into the vineyard a week or so before you're going to pick some fruit. You pick some grape clusters, maybe just finger destem them, squish them up, get some juice, and then, like, probably, hopefully, in some ways, just cover that bucket. Maybe it's cheesecloth, maybe it's another bucket sitting on top of it, but like leave it out in the vineyard, and basically to soak up the vibe of the vineyard, to really get what's going on in the vineyard, and eventually that thing is going to start fermenting spontaneously, and then you can bring that thing back to the winery, and now you've got a ferment going, a small one, before you've even picked, done your first harvest. And this can be used as like basically a starter culture for your fruit as it starts coming in. So you're basically going to, you can use a pied de couve to basically inoculate incoming fruit with what was a spontaneous ferment from your vineyard, from your site. The idea here is you can set up multiple of these, and then you can pick the one that you like the best, like the one that smells the best, the one that seems the healthiest, the happiest, the characteristics you like the most. And then that becomes kind of your inoculant for, that year, or certainly for the first, fruit that comes in. Normally, once you've got a bunch of fruit fermenting in the winery, there's just, like yeasts are just being kicked out in the air all the time. And as fruit comes in, it just wants to ferment that much more because it's surrounded by happy fermentations. But that's just an interesting kind of side note on pied de couves, I guess. Yeah. But I presume you were about to go talk about nutrition.
Yeah, well, I was kind of setting up for, no matter how you plan to ferment, you need to give it what it needs to survive, or you need to set it up properly.
Rehydration.
Yeah, I'll go back also on, you have that option of adding sulfur or not at crush or in bins in the vineyard, like we were mentioning, which would help keep it to one population in theory.
Yeah. Generally, if you're going to inoculate with yeast, you're going to add a decent amount of sulfur at this stage, because the whole point of inoculating with a yeast, a commercial yeast in particular, is that you want that yeast to absolutely dominate. You don't want there to be any question about what it is that's fermenting, or why were you inoculating it in the first place. So you will likely use a decent dose of SO2 to, in some ways sterilize that juice, so that the only thing alive is the thing that you're adding, like right now when you're rehydrating the yeast and adding it to the juice to ferment.
Yeah. So we go through that initial inoculation period. If you are rehydrating a yeast, there are typically a lot of protocols that you can download, or you can just ask Nate Wall, who has a very specific protocol that you remember from years ago.
I know,
which I love.
It's like I haven't done this in like almost 10 years at this point. But so it was kind of dredging things up. There's so again, the more conventional approach, if you're going to use yeast, another kind of byproduct of that is you're also going to be using additional products to help rehydrate those yeasts, or at least I strongly think you should, because while you could just sprinkle it on, directly, or you could just try to rehydrate the yeast just in water, like you would do if you're like baking bread at home or something. You're going to have a lot more success if you use certain yeast rehydration, like nutrients in air quotes here. Really, we're talking like it's like sterols, like fatty acids type things that help the yeast cell wall. It's been like lyophilized. It's been dried out and kind of crushed. And when you're that's how it's dry and sitting in a bag. And so now it needs to reform all those yeast cell walls. And to do that, you can try to just create the right environment for that to happen, so that you can hopefully have like nearly 100% of those dead, not dead, those dried out yeast cells are going to successfully basically come out of dormancy and become alive again. No matter what you do, you're always going to get some of those. Like if you just sprinkle it in there or use water, like the fermentation will still get going, but you may have killed off half or more of the yeast before they even got to your ferment. So if you are going to be inoculating, strongly recommend you use proper rehydration and these quote rehydration nutrients to kind of implement to get the most successful yeast that you can. And then of course this is often followed by these attemperation steps. So like when you're starting this process, it's pretty warm. For the yeast, you're dissolving these rehydration nutrients, 100 degree, used to be even warmer, 110 degree water. Some newer products now can work better at lower temperatures. But then you're adding the yeast to this, and still relatively warm for the rehydration. But now you're going to add it to relatively cold juice. Like it's sitting in a cellar, probably, let's say the yeast is, at 90, 85 degrees, and the cellar's at 50. You can't just add those yeasts straight to that. That would be a temperature shock. You would once again kill a bunch of your yeast. So you want to slowly add some juice into that rehydrating yeast to over a period of time, just to get the temperatures closer before you add it. But again, it's not something we do here, but it is I just kind of wanted to discuss the process. Once however you do it, however you initiate that fermentation, either spontaneously like us, through a pied de cuve, through a very selected yeast that you've rehydrated hopefully carefully and added to that ferment, the next step is, once the fermentation kicks off, you really want to look at the kind of the nutrition, like what does the yeast need to be healthy and happy. And back at the very beginning, we mentioned that you would have sent in, probably you either would take a juice sample and send that in for analysis at a lab, or you might have an in-house lab that you can run numbers yourself. Something else you would have determined during that process, beyond just the pH, the acidity, for those other adjustments that may be made in a conventional approach. You would also learn what's called YAN, yeast assimilable nitrogen. This is a measurement of the juice that is basically a combination of what they call amino acid, or like an organic form of nitrogen, versus an inorganic or an ammonium like form of nitrogen. And it's a combination of those two nitrogen sources and like in terms of how available are they to the yeast to use as nutrition, as they go along. So, it's not good enough to just give them something to eat. You need to give them the proper nutrients so that they have the ability to like digest and metabolize that sugar and convert it ultimately into alcohol, into ethanol to form the wine.
So there are a lot of different routes you can go at this point. A lot of different products that you can use during fermentation. And typically it's kind of you're calling it what, the 2/3, 1/3 ratio of adding a lot of times.
Sometimes, or like half and half is pretty common, right?
Or half and half, yeah.
But let's just talk about what it is.
So kind of during that whole fermentation process, we measure by bricks, and so you're going.
We measure the sugar by bricks to track fermentation.
Thank you. So you're basically measuring and following down the sugar level, right? So the yeast are eating the sugar, and so you're tracking daily on however you may be doing that in your winery. You're tracking and kind of following a line, right? And making sure that it's consistent, because say you take a measurement one day and you say, okay, cool, it's been fermenting properly for a while. You check the next day and all of a sudden it's at the same number it was the day before, or just slightly lower when you had seen it consistently climbing downwards, because at a certain point sometimes that ferment can stall, especially if it's unhappy. So as Nate was mentioning, temperature is really important and just getting it going and happy, but a lot of different additives can be used during this point. One fun one is DAP to talk about. So diammonium phosphate is always an interesting add, especially at a lot of bigger places, because this is something that provides nitrogen and phosphate, but you have to be careful adding it, because it's almost like you're giving a kid sugar. It's food, right? But it's not as nutritional as a lot of other products that we'll get into. So sometimes when you add this, and Nate likes to do half and half at a time.
Well, if I were to do it.
If you were to do it.
Let's just go back.
And so when you add it, you want to be careful, because it will really, it can cause a ferment essentially to overflow in a tank if you're not careful. Okay. So
we talked about the importance of understanding your YAN, right? Your yeast assimilable nitrogen. And the idea here is there's a relationship between the amount of sugar, or the bricks, it's the measurement we use, the amount of sugar you have in a juice, or a must in the case of red wine, and then the amount of nitrogen basically that needs to be available for that amount of sugar to be successfully fermented and converted. So basically, the more sugar you have, the higher nutritive demand there is on that fermentation. And interestingly, going back in terms of every winemaking step before influences the one that comes next. A lot of the yeasts that you were looking at in those catalogs, one of the columns in the spreadsheet of all the different yeasts is basically nitrogen need. And some yeasts have really high nitrogen needs, and some have very low nitrogen needs. What I find so fascinating about spontaneous ferments is if a winemaker knew in advance that they had a low nitrogen juice, they can select a lower nitrogen requiring yeast, and that's probably going to be more successful, even if they're ultimately augmenting with additional nitrogen in various forms. I'll get to the DAP thing in a second. But with spontaneous ferments, what you're basically doing is you're allowing the yeast to self-select. So there's Bueller, who's going to raise their hand and say me? I'm the one who's gonna do this. So you're just letting, because you haven't You haven't selected the yeast. You just know you have a diverse microbial population present because, again, we never added any SO2. We didn't try to do anything to disrupt that. We had a healthy and diverse microbiome in the vineyard. We have a healthy and diverse microbiome in our juice. And we're just setting up these conditions, and we're waiting for one of those to be like, you know what, I like it here. I'm gonna live here. And if it's a lower nitrogen juice, the ones that raise their hand are going to just be the ones that happen to be comfortable in that situation. Whereas if it's a higher nitrogen juice, it might be a slightly different, like clone, or I shouldn't even use that word because it's just it's probably a different species. Heck, it could be a different genre almost of yeast, of Saccharomyces. Certainly different subspecies that might choose to do the ferment in that particular barrel. I mean, each barrel, by the way, can be different, right? Like, the second you start splitting off juices into different places, they all become their own universes, and you can have different pathways. Different wines can go in slightly different ways, especially if they're spontaneously fermenting. You can have those yeasts may make slightly different decisions in one barrel than they do in another, which goes back to just how much attention to detail we pay in the cellar when we're like making wine in the same way. We certainly in no way can we assume that we've got 10 barrels in a lot, that those 10 barrels are the same. Like if you're inoculating those 10 barrels, they're going to be a heck of a lot more similar than if all of those 10 barrels spontaneously fermented in slightly different ways. So that's just a recurring theme that you're going to hear, is that one way of doing like less in the cellar is by just paying a lot of attention at a much smaller scale. So, and it's not lot by lot, it's always barrel by barrel, it's ferment by ferment. Like you need, because each one could be rather different, because we didn't do that. Like we talked about limit variability, we're not limiting the variability. We're actually embracing that variability, because at the end of the day, we're going to blend those 10 barrels back together again, and they're all slightly different. That's just adding complexity, it's adding interest, it's adding just depth and expression to that wine. So you're really getting a full expression by allowing it. That's our philosophy. But getting back to the nutrition, so to have a healthy ferment, you do need a healthy nutrition. And again, this definitely goes back very directly to the vineyard. The yan status of the juice is very much related to the health of the vine in the vineyard to an extent. So different soils, different rootstocks, different locations, different varieties, they're all going to have like slightly different ways of utilizing nitrogen and translocating that down to their grapes. So in different years, some years are like high yan years, some years are low yan years, like for different fruit from different parts of the property. So again, like every single lot, you need to know these numbers. You need to understand what's going on so that you know if you need to make any decisions in the cellar. Nutrition is one where you need to understand your nutrition if you want to have a healthy ferment that completes. So back to DAP. So I said yan was a combination of like inorganic forms of nitrogen. So DAP, diammonium phosphate, is 100% inorganic nitrogen. And as Micah said, like sometimes people use the analogy of like giving a kid junk food, right? Like inorganic nitrogen is very rapidly, it's easily taken up by yeast. It's used very quickly, and then it can kind of result in like a crash after just like giving kid too much sugar. So the idea here is to have balanced nutrition, and DAP very rarely is that. Grapes all come in, I should mention, and when you get that yan number, you're going to have organic and inorganic forms of nitrogen in that grape juice, almost always. I've seen a couple rare circumstances in Eastern Washington. Fruit from Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon is famously very low in yan, and I have actually gotten a non-detectable yan in fruit before from Eastern Washington.
That surprised me.
Which is kind of insane. But in general, you're always going to have some of both. And, different years, different grapes will have a different variety. But it is good to have some of both. in the juice itself. But the thing about DAP is the cheapest, absolutely cheapest form of adding nutrition to a ferment. But it's the bad kind, right? It's the kind that's making the kids jump off the walls, and
which sometimes is what you need.
Well, sadly, I have heard of winemakers using DAP to like jumpstart their ferments.
Oh,
and
wow.
Yeah, well, because when you add DAP, it heats up really fast. Everything goes crazy, but then it crashes.
Yeah.
And like you don't want that. And so do not use DAP like in like instead of
and
temperature
by
control.
Itself too, right? Versus with.
Yeah, so we went through this crazy discussion about like the importance of like if you are adding nutrients, definitely don't add DAP first. Like even if you have like Eastern Washington, insanely low yans, like you are going to have to add something to that for that juice if you want it to ferment. Like you can't ferment with 30 yan, you're more shooting for like 150, just throw out like actual numbers, like 150 to maybe even in a high sugar situation, 200 or maybe even a little more. Like that's the number, right? And if you come in with like 30 yan, you're not going to be able to do that. So the only way of moving the needle on something like that might be a combination of organic and inorganic nutrition. But organic nutrition is a much healthier, more regulated way of feeding a ferment. So organic nitrogen. What's interesting is what is fascinating to me is like we've been making wine for thousands of years, and like we still do not understand a whole lot of this. And every year, like kind of new research comes out that like changes what you thought you knew, and this of winemaking, and this just kind of happens with like somewhat alarming regularity. You're like, wow, I really thought that was done and settled. Apparently not. One interesting thing that they found out about organic nitrogen within the last 10 years, probably maybe 20, is that organic nitrogen, while products that give organic nitrogen give lower amounts of nitrogen, truly, it is there's like a multiplier effect in how well the yeast use that. So organic nitrogen is utilized like 3 to 4 times more effectively than inorganic nitrogen. So as a winemaker, if you are doing these additions, you really want to set the yeast up to be very successful in how it utilizes organic nitrogen. And that would be, if you're doing nutrition adds to a ferment, you want to add that organic nitrogen first. So, DAP would be the one end, like a Fermate O or something like an organic nitrogen product would be the other end of that spectrum. And then there's some things in the middle, like
we are
Fermate
consulting
K,
at this point for you, by the way.
which is a combination of DAP, basically,
Yes.
and inorganic and organic nitrogen. But the point is yes, I guess we are. But like that if you add that organic nitrogen initially, you're basically setting up that mother cell, like the first of like several generations, 6-7 generations of yeasts that are going to get through that ferment. You're setting that those yeasts up for success in the coming generations, and they are going to actually strengthen their organic nitrogen transport proteins to be able to basically move across the cell walls. We talked about cell walls when we were talking about yeast rehydration, but it's kind of hard to get stuff from outside a yeast to inside a yeast, and so they need to like actively do that. Like they need to pump against a pressure gradient, basically. So they need to want to do that. And if you give them organic nitrogen, they're like, hey, there's all this organic nitrogen around. I should probably like have these transport proteins that allows me to get this organic nitrogen. And so if you set them up that way, they're going to continue to utilize organic nitrogen fairly successfully. If you set them up, with a whole bunch of DAP, a whole bunch of inorganic nitrogen, they might never really develop super good like ways of utilizing organic nitrogen. And like organic nitrogen's like that's the meat and potatoes, right? Like DAP's the Twinkie. Like you don't want them to eat the Twinkie and then like just peter out. Like they need to go the distance. And so just that kind of combination of just making sure you're looking at where those nitrogen sources are coming from as you feed your ferment is really important. Back to Troon, though, the one other thing we have ever added to a ferment here at Troon outside of sulfur SO2 before bottling, the only other thing we have added to our ferments is organic nitrogen. And that is on a very case-by-case basis. and it's based on different vineyard blocks. Like we have replanted our vineyard blocks. We have different vines at different ages in their life cycle. Older vines certainly have deeper roots. They have a better availability of getting of meeting their nutrient needs better, things like that. If we have ever had deficiencies, we have used small amounts of organic nitrogen to supplement our spontaneous ferments. Again, on a very case-by-case basis. It's not even every year. It's a ferment here and there, but that is important that we do want our ferments to be healthy and finish. So that is something that we do look at. But then we have the ability, luckily, as an estate vineyard, to turn around and say, okay, look at these yans that we were getting in this fruit. What can we do in the vineyard to address this from a vine health, vine nutrition standpoint, so that next year we don't have to make that same decision in the cellar. And that's what we're able to do here is that constant improvement and the feedback between the winemaking in the cellar and the vineyard and the farming practices, to kind of again push everything like as far forward as possible, like push it into the vineyard and make those decisions in the vineyard whenever possible.
Yeah, and I think no matter what style you're making wine in, this step is super important. And no matter how you're making wine, case by case is the best way to do it. And maybe one year, for whatever reason, you end up ordering a product that you wouldn't usually use. But the goal always is, as Nate's saying, to be looking at numbers and figuring out how you can improve the vineyard's health, and therefore hopefully not have to make as many ads here if it's possible. I think we can move from there into malolactic fermentation, because ideally you have a healthy ferment. You ferment out all of the sugars, so you're at 0 grams per liter, which typically you might have a little bit left, but at a certain point, malolactic fermentation either will naturally occur, or you can also add a product. Going back to what Nate was describing, it's kind of fun looking through what you might add, but
way fewer choices.
Way fewer choices on this one. The other thing that you can do is, we have barrels fermenting, mainly barrels fermenting of all of our white wines, but you could either add something into a tank of this prior to barreling it down, or you can add barrel by barrel if you want to make your life a little bit more difficult, or maybe you want to run trials on things too. That would be another reason to, break up ones with product versus without. But that is the secondary fermentation stage. And another thing that you want to make sure actually finishes, especially if you are making low intervention wines.
Yeah, so, the decision like to MLF or not MLF, that is the question. At Troon, the answer is always yes. And so all of our wines fully go through malolactic fermentation here. And I guess it should be, as Micah mentioned, sometimes this is called like a secondary fermentation. It's important to note, though, that this is actually done by a bacteria. So the primary fermentation, converting the sugar into the alcohol, that is yeast. That is almost definitely Saccharomyces cerevisiae or some very close relative thereof. Whereas with malolactic fermentation, this is not a true fermentation, but it is a transformation that bacteria are doing that is changing malic acid, which I mentioned earlier. Tartaric and malic are the two main acids in grapes. It's changing the malic acid into lactic acid. Interestingly, going back to that point, the reason why you add tartaric if you were acidifying rather than malic is because the malic is less stable, right? It could undergo this malolactic fermentation, so the tartaric acid is a much more stable form of the acid, and this is partly why. But so to MLF or not to MLF, so that process of converting malic to lactic is somewhat of a natural de-acidification step. So going all the way back to our first decision that we made, which is when to pick the grapes. When you pick on pH, you know what your acidity is. So we already know that our wines are going to go through full malolactic. So we know that there's going to be a natural deacidification step occurring later on in the process of the wine. So we take that into account when we're picking that first, like our baseline acidity of our grapes. We make that picking decision with the foreknowledge that several things are going to happen, one of which is malolactic fermentation. That's going to alter that acidity later. So if you hadn't made that decision, that might be a reason why wineries do not do malolactic fermentation, is because they don't have that acid to spare. They need to keep that acid. They can't naturally acidify their juice, wine at this point anymore. So they decide to prevent that. And malolactic is very easy to prevent because, like I said, this is actually a bacteria rather than a yeast, and so it's quite sensitive to sulfur. So if you don't want malolactic, one of the easiest things you can do is just add sulfur, and that will prevent malolactic from going forward. We have not yet added a drop of sulfur to our wines here at Troon. So, of course, everything is we're not preventing it in any way. So everything is going to go through malolactic at its own pace. Just like yeast, if you let it, if you build it, they will come. Like these bacteria are present, and they will arrive, and they will convert malic into lactic, in each of these barrels, even without you inoculating it. Of course, conventional wineries will make that inoculation because you're adding billions more. That process occurs much faster. You can have, because they also can't add sulfur yet. So they need to get their wines through malolactic fermentation before they can add sulfur, because as I just said, sulfur is how you prevent it. So if they want malolactic to occur, they're going to probably want to add a selected malolactic strain so that they can get it through malo quickly and then add sulfur to, in their minds, start that protective phase of the wine aging process.
Yeah, a lot of the time at a more conventional winery too, there's a very specific timeline of when the wine needs to be ready. And also, like Nate was mentioning, kind of ticking all of those boxes and just getting that wine completely into wine and then protected by sulfur would be the goal. When you're managing, thousands of barrels versus 50, it looks a lot different day to day. But with malolactic fermentation, we are tracking that. Here at Troon, we actually do chromatography. Then we double check what we have been running. And as I was mentioning with the sugar, you can look and see, okay, this rate looks normal. Consistently, this process is happening. If you run into any issues, you can navigate that when and if that happens. But once all of the malic acid is converted into lactic acid, we actually have something in-house to double check that has in fact happened. We also taste barrel to barrel. We're lucky enough to be able to do that. And then if things check out number-wise, and we also like the taste, and we think it's ready in this year, when was the first one? March, I guess.
Yeah. We're still not. This is we're recording this at the beginning of April, and we're less than half the cellar at this point.
So not everything has even received any sulfur yet from the 2024 vintage, but some things did start appearing to be ready, again, due to numbers and our tasting in early March. And so, we prefer to make sure that we triple check, I would say, by tasting and make sure that things are really in the correct state and that they're ready for that next phase of their life, which is to age in the same vessel, the same barrel, until they get bottled. And
just to double down what you just said, again, this is barrel by barrel and not lot by lot.
Yes.
And that's with our approach with spontaneous, everything here, it's so important that we have the ability to do this, because in most locations, like when you're testing for ML being finished, like if you have 20 barrels in a lot, you're just going to like take a composite sample of those 20 barrels, and when that show's done, you're like, okay, cool, that's done, we're going to sell for that lot. It's like, but that's not, we can't and don't want to do that. We treat each vessel completely independently, even though theoretically it's the same as its neighbor. It's not. So all of our decisions are just made at a much smaller scale, like vessel by vessel, as opposed to like a lot by lot. And that is that's a consequence of making wine this way, but it's one of the ways that we're able to make wine in this way.
Yeah, I would say it is a little extra work, but at the same time it allows us to get to know our wines a little bit better, and is also just ensuring that we're not needing to do certain things later on. But at a more conventional spot, there would, of course, be some other options, a little wiggle room with that. But that basically takes us through the malolactic stage and into aging. All right, so for the aging process, this can look a lot different depending on the variety we're talking about, and winemaking style, and then of course if you're going to be adding anything during this time. But going off of malolactic fermentation, for us, we taste everything to make sure that process has actually finished, and that we also like the taste of each barrel. So we're testing not just lots, but barrel by barrel, to ensure that it's finished, and also to make sure that once it gets its first edition of SO2, that we're not preventing it from being the best wine possible.
Yeah, so during the aging process of a white wine, there are, especially white wines in barrel, there are many considerations that winemakers might think about. Oftentimes, the one that people are probably the most familiar with is if you're going to be stirring those barrels. So barrel stirring is a way of basically increasing the lees contact in that wine. So if you think about a barrel of wine, and when it's fermenting, there's all these yeasts. It's an active process. It kind of like, in ancient times, they actually were trying to figure out like why the water looks like it was boiling, even though it was cold, right? That's actually the basis of the word. So there's a lot of motion during fermentation, but when fermentation's over, things start settling, and all the dead yeast cells and things settle down to the bottom of the barrel, and you'll eventually have fairly clean wine, wine on top of like a layer of the lees down at the bottom of the barrel. And there's a lot of interesting compounds in the lees, and some winemakers want to basically make sure more of that can get into their wine, and they would accelerate this process by stirring. There's stirring wands that it's a curved metal instrument with a kind of a little, like a, I don't know what you want to call it, a little tab on the bottom that can kind of swing back and forth, so that you can, even if the barrels are stacked, you can get this wand inside the barrel, and it can get all the way down to the bottom of the barrel, and then that little tab kind of flips sideways, so it can almost like kind of scrape along the bottom of the barrel, and you can move it back and forth, and that kicks up all those lees into suspension again. And what you're looking for there is in the lees, there's a lot of, in particular, interesting proteins. Manoproteins are one of the ones that people find most interesting. There's sapid proteins, so it's, even though it's a protein, it can come across as like slightly sweet or rich. It's a sweet type of a protein, and so there's a lot of reasons why you might want to do this in a white wine. Famously, some Chardonnays, right, might want a lot of like that richness and sweetness from the lees in there. So winemakers might do topping. Now, you never get nothing for free, right? And so while you're stirring, stirring. While you're stirring these barrels, You're also, though, introducing a lot of oxygen. So, you're vigorously moving a stirring instrument around inside the barrel. And yeah, it's not a huge opening, but every time you pop the bung off of a barrel, you're going to be introducing oxygen back into that barrel. And so a couple consequences of that is that you're likely going to need, at a minimum, you might need a higher free sulfur level to help. So adding more sulfur to that wine to help prevent the oxidation and like the browning and of that wine. And there's also a potential just greater risk for spoilage in terms of the bungs. Like if you lift, every time you lift that bung, it's not just oxygen gets in, but it could be spoilage organisms from outside could get in there. So you should hopefully be using clean bungs when you're rebunging the barrels and like cleaning the surface of the barrel to keep everything nice and clean. But that would be the oxygen pickup in particular, especially to us, is one reason why at Troon we don't stir any of our barrels. When we are given the option, I kind of prefer the more like passive approach, more like steeping, like a tea bag. Those lees will break down, especially if given enough time. So I don't really feel the need to accelerate that process with stirring, particularly because of those negative, potential effects with oxygen. We use incredibly low sulfur levels here. We mentioned that we do add the sulfur after the completion of malolactic, but it's a fairly low level. Nothing like it's generally it's about a 40 part total add, and whereas a lot of wineries might try to maintain 25, 30, 35 parts of free sulfur without derailing this. So when you add sulfur, there's going to be two things that happen. A large portion of added sulfur, sulfites, SO2, immediately get bound up in the wine, and then only a portion of it remains as what's known as free SO2. That free SO2 portion is the portion of the added sulfur that's kind of effectively doing antioxidative, antimicrobial tasks for you in that wine, and a whole bunch of it gets bound up. So we add very low sulfur levels here, and so that is one reason why we don't want to open up our barrels any more than we have to. However, you can think of vessels again here, and in particular, a concrete egg is interesting because the shape of the egg actually keeps a lot of those lees in suspension. So there's that shape of the egg kind of encourages these like natural kind of recirculation that lifts lees up off the bottom and keeps them in suspension. So even without opening that vessel, it's kind of like getting lees stirring, but without the potential for that oxygen pickup. Similarly, amphora. Amphora are actually, they're made out of clay. Clay is a charged particle, and proteins want to, so things like lees want to stick to the clay. So instead of settling all the way down at the bottom, of the amphora, they will actually stick to the sides of that vessel. So instead of just getting this thin layer at the bottom of the vessel, you're actually getting like 360 degrees, like a surrounding hug of lees to that wine. So there are other ways that we can kind of still work to achieve similar effects in our cellar without, for example, barrel stirring in this particular case.
I like the surrounding hug.
It's a hug. It's a hug of lees.
And so we just gave you a lot of information to kind of go back to. So this aging period, that is once fermentation is done, and if you so choose to go through malolactic fermentation, that's also complete. So vintage to vintage, the temperatures will vary of your cellar. It might take longer one year than another for these to actually complete. But essentially, once your wine has gone through those processes, then you're into this aging time where, again, white wines are typically bottled pretty quickly, within a few months. but you're going to start to kind of see like this pattern of management happening in your cellar. So Nate was talking about stirring as a possibility. We spoke about SO2 and how we add a certain amount of sulfur, and we're not necessarily trying to get it back up to a certain target number. But what a lot of people will do is they kind of start this, monthly, I would say, is the most common pattern, where they're checking to see where the SO2 is at. They're sending in either an ETS sample to another lab, or using their own to figure out how much SO2 is in the vessel or the lot. They're adding sulfur to those vessels, and then they're topping the wine. And so you start to see that pattern replay. Then again, if there's stirring in your program, you'll put that into your work orders weekly or whatever your regimen is. But you kind of get into this period where you see a pattern, and you're also tasting. You might even be starting to come up with your blends and kind of finalizing wines. But this aging period that happens, it doesn't always necessarily have to be in barrels. We used that because most of our white wines are in barrels. But Nate also touched on, our amphora, concrete. So it's not necessarily classified by being in barrel. It's just that time period and the fact that you're kind of managing the wine during that time.
True, and the larger the facility, especially, the more likely there'll be a lot of aging performed in stainless steel tanks. There is certainly reason to do this even at a smaller scale. Especially wines that you're looking for kind of a crispness, that acidity, like Sauvignon Blanc, or varieties that really want that like fresh lift. Since stainless steel is completely impervious to gas transfer, it's much less oxygen is getting in there. It's a much more reductive environment. You can preserve sometimes some of these more ephemeral aromatics better. And if that's the approach you're going for, you might do it in stainless steel. But that kind of reminds me, so talking about the lees aging then in, lees stirring and or trying to get those lees effects in barrels, there are other methods that can be employed conventionally, particularly if you are using like a stainless steel vessel, but you don't want to miss out on some of those lees benefits, is you can just add them. So there are lots of different like lees products that are basically like yeast derivatives, that you can just replace the lees with lees from a bag. And sometimes that happens if you like rack off the actual, wine lees for one reason or another. If you're, say, like racking to tank, you're leaving the lees behind, and you might rack back to barrel. Or if it was in tank to begin with, and you want to kind of have more of this lees impact, you can add on. You can add all sorts of different products to the wine that would mimic those effects, or just straight up add like those manoproteins or other interesting compounds I was talking about that can be released from that lees aging process. At Troon, we actually stay on our primary lees throughout the entire aging process. So we don't stir and we don't rack off of those lees. We only rack off the lees just to go to tank before bottling. So we'll get to that when we talk about the blending and bottling. But at Troon, we don't do any of that as well.
Yeah, basically our aging process for white wines is us still kind of monitoring bricks and malolactic, because since we're not using anything, we're not adding anything in, we're literally just keeping things the right temperature and then tracking as we go. And then we're adding some SO2 at a certain point and topping.
Actually, I had another thing that I just thought about, because I did start mentioning other vessels, and we've talked about barrels, but I definitely want to talk about the concept of like oak as an additive, because we do use all neutral French oak barrels here at Troon. Like we mentioned before, it's very, very old. Our newest barrels are maybe 5 years old, so through 10, 12 plus years old. And so there's very little flavor a modification of the wine being stored in these vessels. They're basically just they're vessels, containers for the wine that has these different properties, but taste is not one of them. The use of new and even newish oak absolutely imparts strong flavors that can often, in my opinion, very much overwhelm the underlying wine. And even though it's never, you'll never see oak listed as an ingredient. Actually, you'll never see any of these listed as an ingredient because there's no ingredient labeling requirements on any bottles of wine in the United States currently. Although Troon does label all of our additives, which is basically grapes and sulfur. I just strongly consider that oak should be viewed as an additive because it is a flavor that is not found in the grapes on their own. And depending on the amount of oak that can be used, it is a very strong and often overwhelming flavor that can really fundamentally change the character of wine. But it is not actually considered an additive. It's considered a storage vessel, but it can actually have more profound impact on the final wine than most of these additives we've been talking about.
Yeah, and a lot of winemakers do that very well. This is a stylistic choice, and also due to the fact that we do so much work here in our vineyards and with our farming practices, we really want to showcase the fruit. So I think this kind of brings us into the blending period, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the next step, now that we're passing aging, gets into the blending season, which is one of my favorites, kind of like cooking. So everybody goes about this differently, and quite often you have some idea of what your blend, and by the way, I want to say we're saying blending, but that is more so a term of like blending vessels. So we're not necessarily saying every wine is a blend of different varietals of grape. But it's just actually putting together all of the different elements of your wine. So even if you have a Sauvignon Blanc that was the same vineyard and it got broken up into different vessels, you're now seeing those being put together, how they actually all taste. So during this season, technically it kind of goes hand in hand with aging, right? So you're tasting things separately and then slowly together to try and figure out what your final wine is going to be. And we actually did a full podcast on this too. So if you want more information on it, you can go back and check that one out. But we like to sit down outside of the cellar, basically taste a little bit of every single vessel that might go into each wine. And we'll also have separate blending sessions for this, or maybe group together a few that are similar or have possible elements that could go into one or two different wines. But we'll sit down, try everything separately, and then slowly start to kind of blend them together into different options. And this will usually be at least 2, maybe 3, 4 different sessions. You can even start to blend things in the cellar physically, taste it, and kind of like sit on certain decisions, because sometimes one day you really think one more barrel added to that blend is going to be amazing. And then, we blend it in the cellar, we try it, we're like, wait, actually, we don't want to do anything to this, or we end up adding more than we thought we would. So this is when you really start to see things come together. And you also, if you add anything during your winemaking process, you're going to want to make any last minute adjustments during this time to the chemistry, just before the final steps that we'll go into after.
Yeah, probably, the most typical late addition at this stage would probably just be one more acid adjustment in a conventional setting. Again, we never adjust the chemistry of our wines here at Troon, but if you've, especially once you start in a larger winery, a conventional winery, you start putting those pieces together and you realize, when we blend these together, the acidity is not what we wanted to have that balanced wine, or this microbial safety. We actually didn't really talk about that. That part of the fact that part of the concept of pH and acidity in wine is that there's the lower, the lower the pH, the higher the acidity, the more microbially stable that wine is going to be in the long run. The much less likely you are to experience, spoilage or off aromas or flavors in that wine. So this could be that last chance to up your acidity a little bit if you found that it was lacking. And you're always going to want to do finish with all of these blending, putting all the wine together before you move to this next step, which in white wines is stabilization. And there's kind of two fundamental aspects of stabilization. Really, it's kind of like cold and hot. So the yin and the yang there, and they're looking at different things. And cold stabilization, especially in white wines, is acknowledging the fact that a lot of people are going to throw these in their fridge. A lot of fridges are pretty darn cold, just barely above freezing in some cases. You could have 35, 36, certainly 37 degree refrigerators. So that's pretty cold. And one of the things that can be unstable in all wines, but you don't really notice it in a red wine due to the color, are tartrates. And tartrates is generally what happens when you have the tartaric acid that we've talked about several times in wine. Depending on the amount of tartaric acid you have, the amount of potassium you have, and the pH of the wine and the amount of alcohol in that wine, you can look at the likelihood of the potassium joining up with the tartrate and becoming like potassium bitartrate precipitation, basically. So you get little crystals that precipitate in the bottom of whatever vessel it's in. So this could be in the winery or this could be in a finished bottle of wine. Those tartrates are completely harmless. They're only it's just an aesthetic issue, quite frankly. But many conventional wineries want to absolutely make sure that doesn't happen. And there's a couple different ways of doing that. The simplest way is just getting it cold, and luckily, depending on where you're at, sometimes that's just the cellar is pretty cold in the wintertime, even in a lot of small wineries like ours. And so a lot of the wines kind of naturally cold stabilize, at least a good portion of it, somewhat naturally, just due to colder temperatures in the winter. So they do get some of that kind of for free, but oftentimes a more direct method is when you've got the wine blended and put into a stainless steel tank. Those stainless steel tanks normally have, they're called jackets, glycol jackets that allow for you to control the temperature of that tank, and you can drop the temperature down to about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, so below freezing, but the alcohol in the wine actually keeps them from freezing. But at those very cold temperatures, you're going to start precipitating those crystals much faster. You can actually accelerate that crystal formation by adding basically cream of tartar. You add, you need. There's two phases in crystal growth. There's like the a nucleation phase and then the crystal formation. And the nucleation phase is the long part. And if you're adding cream of tartar, you've just added millions, billions, I don't know, of nucleation sites. So a spot for a crystal to grow, and in that cold temperature, then those crystals can grow quite quickly, and then you can have your wine cold stable in a faster time. And
to add to this, so Nate's referencing these tartrates that you would see if you've ever poured a glass of wine and someone's joked about wine diamonds. That's what this is. It's those little crystals that come out, or if you forgot maybe a bottle of white wine in your fridge for a really long time, you pull it out, you're like, oh, what's forming on there? That's a good way to tell it's probably not cold stabilized. There's wiggle room to that, of course, but that's essentially what you're looking at. And to give you a visual too, in the cellar, if I were cold stabilizing something in a tank and dropping it down to below freezing, then after you go through your whole process of bottling and everything, and now that tank is empty, the whole outside, basically you get in to clean it, right? Or you're looking into it, and it looks like the inside of that wine bottle would. So it's like tartrates just collect everywhere. You have to basically power wash it off. So again, this is not a good or bad thing whether you're going through this process, but it's just something interesting to know when you're drinking wine. So now you know if you pour that out into your glass.
Yeah, and again, there's always trade-offs that happen when you get a wine cold. The gas, the ability to dissolve gases increases. So in particular, really cold white wines, you're nervous about how much oxygen you're getting dissolved into that wine. So again, you would look at like how everything you can do to exclude oxygen and or perhaps making sure that free sulfur level is high enough to have that anti-oxidative property to kind of minimize any potential oxidation of the wine in that process. There are ways around, well, and I guess I was talking about at the beginning when we were talking about settling, the same thing applies here. It does take a lot of energy to cool down a wine for this cold stabilization process, especially if you're not adding those crystals for the formation. You might have to hold the wine at 28 degrees for months, perhaps. And that could be a large power draw. So there are actually other products that you could use instead that not only do not need to be cold, they actually work better when it's not cold. There's a CMC. I should probably know that acronym. Cell stab is the common name for that. But there's basically it's these cellulose additives. There you go. Carboxymethylcellulose. There we go.
You knew it. You already knew it.
Yeah, sure. It's been a long time since I've actually had a bottle of that sitting anywhere near me. But yeah, so it's kind of interesting in how this process works. Is I kind of mentioned that there's potassium and tartaric acid floating around in the wine, and to form these crystals, that potassium, that K plus positive, needs to see this negatively charged tartaric, basically ion. And when you add all this cellulose product, it actually almost shields those from ever finding each other. So they're just like out there looking for love and never finding it. So they can never find each other to pair up and then like settle out as a crystal. So by adding some of these products, you can have a cold, stable wine without ever actually getting it cold. So there's definitely environmental benefits to that, a heck of a lot less energy usage. It's also pretty much immediate. Like you don't have to wait around for that cold stabilization process. So distinct advantages there. There's also uses for this in sparkling context, sparkling wines where it could be more difficult to cold stabilize those wines due to the sparkling process, which we're not going to get into right now. But yeah, it's always nice to know that there's so many options available in a conventional setting, which really does give winemakers a lot of control over a lot of these processes. We choose not to go through this process here at Troon. There's other things you can make these considerations upstream to try to minimize potential for tartrate formation in your finished wine in a more kind of natural way. But it from time to time, we do actually have some precipitation of tartrates in some of our white wines. But again, it's not excessive, and it's also in no way harmful. So just that very last couple drops of wine, you might have a little sediment in that, and that's just kind of a sign that this wine was not, I guess, manipulated in that way.
Yeah, good chance maybe some low intervention practices going on. The other thing would be heat stabilization. So for this, and we actually already spoke about bentonite clay a little bit, but you essentially are trying to bind unstable proteins, and then they drop off to the bottom of the tank, similar to the smoothie or juice analogy we had earlier. So again, we do not heat stabilize here either. But if you would prefer not to have any haze in your wine, and maybe you're a little bit larger winery, for several reasons, you might want to go through this process. And with both heat and cold stabilization, Nate and I were kind of talking about this, and it's interesting because it's not just a style thing, but it's also the goal of getting the best version of your wine on the table for your consumer. So typically the bigger your winery, this is kind of an insurance policy along with a lot of other final stages up to the actual bottling of your wine.
Yeah, and bentonite, as opposed to cold stabilization, using bentonite for heat stabilization can have a very, again, profound impact to the flavors of the wine.
Yes.
So bentonite, while very effective at removing proteins, and as Micah said, so the main thing here is instead of crystals forming on the bottom of a bottle with heat instability, like a protein haze can form. So there's all sorts of proteins in wine, and if the wine gets very warm, the normal example is if like you're out, tasting wine and a trip in the summer, and you like buy some bottles and you like throw them in the back of your car, like trunk of your car or something, and it's baking all day long, and then maybe you even forget that they're there, and like a week later you're like, oh yeah, I bought these wines last weekend. So those have now been like baking in the back of your trunk for quite a while, and that amount of heat can basically cause proteins to become unstable, fall out of solution, and they will never like reabsorb. So the wine can look, it'll be like a wispy white, oftentimes kind of haziness to that wine, which is actually a little different than sometimes you can get a similar effect due to the use of like concrete or amphora, because of, especially amphora, because of the attraction to the sides of that vessel of these larger lees, as I was mentioning. It actually leaves the incredibly fine lees in suspension, and so those wines can have a somewhat similar appearance they can have a slight haziness to it, but it's not due to protein instability. It's due to these incredibly fine particles that will just never settle out, and that's due to this kind of special activity that goes on in amphora. But with the protein instability being treated with bentonite, a very common approach is just to do a test, which is oftentimes rather extreme, trying to you'll do a bench scale yourself. You might do it yourself at the winery, where you add different amounts of bentonite to small samples of that wine, and then you subject it to a whole bunch of heat, and then you can either measure the turbidity then of those wines after that, and see which addition of bentonite left you with clear wine, didn't throw that protein haze, or you can of course send this to a lab. They can do a similar test for you. A lot of wineries will just take that result of oh well, I guess we had 3 pounds per 1,000 gallons of wine of bentonite, and like that makes it okay. They might just add that without even tasting what the effects that
it's very
has
important to taste
on the wine, because I've said you never get anything for free, and in particular with bentonite, it's a blunt instrument that removes a lot of other things out of the wine, other than just this thing causing the protein haze. So I just sometimes get a little frustrated when I see wines that where the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater here. It's where you had a wine that was really pretty and aromatic and initially, and then when you went to use all this bentonite to heat stabilize it, on the off chance that someone subjected a couple bottles to this intense heat, you actually treat the entire wine in a way that can sometimes really dramatically affect the how that wine smells and tastes, normally fairly negatively. So the importance of the finding. So sure, find what that safe, quote unquote, safe amount of bentonite is. Determine just how likely your bottles are to even experience those temperatures. Depending on your distribution, this could be a thing to consider. If you have a distribution far away, certainly international distribution, or anything where you're not sure what how safe your wines are, how temperature controlled your wines are during transport, then you might be more likely to be more conservative on that. But please definitely taste through what those effects are and try to find maybe at least a happy medium between what's completely safe versus what still tastes like, smells and tastes really good to you, based on the likelihood that that's even going to happen to any of the wines.
Yeah, because like everything, you don't want to look at numbers, have it tell you something, make your decision based on that. And, at this stage, like we're about to go into the final filtration and bottling of the wine. So you're right at the end point, and then to put in a product that actually makes it taste not as good as it would have is like, pretty heartbreaking. So you don't want to add something in and then realize it completely negatively affected your wine. So yeah, we're on to filtration now. So essentially the last step before putting things into bottle is really paying attention to numbers because you want to make sure that that wine is not going to re-ferment in bottle, and you want to make sure that you have a little insurance policy in the case that there's maybe any type of microbial growth. So, winemakers are worried often about like Brett. If a wine didn't go through Mallow, we, gave you that option that maybe you don't actually go through that step with a white wine. There are a lot of options for filtration. Do you want to go into what they are?
Sure. Yeah. So, and again, the more filtration serves a couple different purposes. The simplest is it definitely results in a much clearer wine. So if there were anything like I was talking about before, any like very small lees particles or something that was staying in suspension, things like that, filtration will kind of clean that up and add to like a brighter, more sparkling look in the glass. There's a couple different ways of filtering. A common old school way is what's known as a plate and frame or pad filters. It's a series of pads of physical filtration where you kind of pump or force the wine from through kind of successive layers of pads of different thicknesses, different filtration abilities. Like these are measured in like micrometers, right? So like what's the smallest particle that can get through a certain size pad, and if you had a kind of what am I looking for? The cloudier the wine is, you would want to start with like a larger openings, right? Just kind of like if you're sieving, multiple types of sand or something, like you have multiple sieves, like one catches the gravel and the next one catches like the large sand particles, and then you get like the finer dust. It's the same concept here. So you might need to run, all I'm trying to say poorly here is that you might need to run a wine through different types of pads, so multiple times, to get down to the level of filtration that you're looking for if you're using that like plate and frame filtration. There's preparations that you do to try to minimize the impact of flavor that these can have, but they can leave a distinctive kind of somewhat papery taste in the wine if it's not done well. You can definitely do it well. I've tasted people who are really good at plate and frame filtration, and it can be done well, but it's also easy to not do well. So that could also add an impact that you weren't anticipating on the wine. Yes, you now have a cleaner wine, but you've added a kind of cardboardy, papery taste to that wine. So to avoid that, technology stepped in, and in the last probably 15 years, really, cross-flow filtration became much more common. You want to talk about that?
Sure. I mean, I think that's probably the most common filtration, because whether or not your heat and cold stabilization, like whether that's in your practice or not, what I would see most often, and I think you were the same, is there would be a cross-flow filtration, and then you make all your final little adjustments that we'll talk about in a second, and then day of bottling is sterile filtration in line.
Yeah, as long as that, so the cross-flow filtration is pretty soon before like bottling, right? You don't want it to sit around too long between that crossflow filtration and the sterile filtration in the bottling truck.
Yeah, I think it's typically like up to 3 days, right?
Yeah.
Most places will maybe schedule it so that you're cross-flowing one day and then bottling the next. There's also Velcrin, which is an option. But yeah, all of these are essentially just to give you an insurance policy against residual sugar and microbial spoilage are the main things here. And Nate was kind of mentioning different size molecules, and in theory, during this whole winemaking process, all of the different tools you have step by step have gotten you to a place where filtration should not really be like a huge issue. But if you're using other products too, then you have to kind of be careful with how you layer those together.
Yeah, I guess because you had brought up malolactic earlier, and this is a good example, is that if you have chosen not to go through malolactic in this wine, as many white wines do not go through malolactic, or at least do not fully go through malolactic, meaning there's still some malic acid left in that wine before bottling. That would be a time where you would consider these types of filtration, because just because that malolactic fermentation didn't happen in your cellar does not mean it's not still going to happen inside the bottle. So I've definitely opened this up before, some red wines, or even red wines, I should say, but like white wines, anything that was not fully gone through malolactic in the cellar before bottling. It can happen in the bottle later if you don't filter out any of the yeast that could continue at this level, it's bacteria, any of the bacteria capable of performing the malolactic fermentation. So that can result in a little bit of a fizzy wine, because even though it's not a fermentation, this malolactic fermentation can create carbon dioxide. So inside of a sealed wine bottle after bottling, it can result in some fizziness when that wine is opened up. So if you didn't have that, like on purpose, right? If you're a winemaker who chose not to have the malolactic fermentation go through on your white wine, you are going to want to filter out the bacteria that could cause that to occur in your bottle, just so you know that your bottle is going to be stable.
Yeah, we talk about, if you taste Brett in wine, that can sometimes be a topic of like, oh, is it too much Brett? But aside from the taste of it, also on the numbers side, you want to be really careful, because if you're not following if you're not properly like looking at all of your numbers, catching things like that, and then going through with these practices that match what is in bottle, then as Nate's describing, it's like you can pull out a bottle from your fridge or your wine rack and see, a bunch of CO2, and it's like that's exactly what we're talking about preventing here with all of these steps.
And so at Troon, we are unfined and unfiltered. And so what that means is, as we mentioned back when we were discussing malolactic, is very important that 100% of our wines completely finish malolactic. They completely go to dryness during fermentation. There's no sugar, there's no malic, because we are not filtering our wines here. So we need them to be that much more stable by the time they go into bottle, so that we know none of these potential changes are going to occur in our bottles, because we did not filter out all of the yeast and the bacteria and the things that could potentially cause some of those changes. We did not do that.
We like to challenge ourselves here.
Which, we've talked, we're probably doing a podcast on this specifically, but it is, in fact, this is a Demeter requirement. The idea here is that wines should be a living thing, and by filtering out all the wine, like literally sterilizing the wine during the bottling process, like through a sterile filtration, you're removing some life from that wine. And there hasn't been a lot of super compelling studies that I've read, but there are definite aging differences between sterile filtered and unfiltered wines, and certainly anecdotally, the unfiltered wines always age much more interestingly, like, really continue to evolve and get, depth and complexity throughout that aging process that a sterile wine just can't quite match.
Yeah. So once you actually get through that step, there are a few adjustments sometimes that people do. Here at Troon, we don't do either of these, but if you would like, you can always sparge with nitrogen to remove dissolved oxygen if you're looking to hit a target number. And you could also use CO2 to, again, sparge into the wine. This can add a certain amount of freshness and vibrancy depending on the variety and the style of wine that you're looking to create. So just a few little minor things there, and then immediately after the wine goes into bottle. I have had a few people ask me this. I'm not sure if you've gone through this, but someone in a tasting room that I worked in a long time ago was like, it's crazy because winemakers seem so stressed on the day of bottling. Like, why are they so stressed? The wine's already made. You're just putting it into bottle. But that day can be a lot because that one last step has to happen correctly, right? So hopefully your labels showed up, depending on what your packaging is. That wine is now in its perfect form, right? But you want to make sure that all the wines you're bottling that day make it into the right bottle with the right label. And then if it's summer, they get out of the heat and put in a cold room. So the actual day of bottling can be a lot of anxiety depending on how many things you're putting into bottle.
The last chance you have with that wine. The really kids are leaving the house. They're going off to college. That's it.
Yeah.
They're done. They don't need you anymore. So yeah, there can be some anxiety. I think most winemakers feel a bit of anxiety at bottling,
excitement too,
and excitement, and then also relief.
Yeah,
you're like, okay, for better or for worse, that wine is now out of my control. Let's move on almost immediately to the next wine we're about to deal with. But yeah, so during bottling. Bottling actually, and this is something else that's really happened within the last just couple of decades, is the advent of mobile bottling services, which I think is just wonderful. If you've never seen it, there's basically a semi-tractor trailer has all of the entire bottling equipment inside of it. And that can just drive to your facility and show up. They totally sterilize their system for you, good to go. And then you basically just have, your job is to take your wine from your winery in a hose out to their truck, and then everything you need for the bottling is right there in the truck. And so, empty bottles kind of go in and full bottles come back out. It's a great thing. Normally we only bottle generally at 3 different points of the year. So, it might be a day or two each time, but still that is like 350 plus days that we're not using bottling equipment. And so to not have like bottling lines sitting around collecting dust and probably something breaking, that then when you go to use it, you're going to have to spend a day fixing everything that maybe not be working. I really do appreciate the efficiency of these mobile bottling. So we do use that. But part of what can happen in the, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say that's a good point because I've always used the bottling trucks, but that's a lie. I worked at one spot that had their own, so they could literally just bottle whenever they want to.
I've done that too, right? which is so convenient.
Nice. Mm-hmm. But you have options essentially, so it's a little harder, I would say, when you're scheduling one out because you're trying to figure out when the bottling truck is available, when you are. Then, as we mentioned, it's a whole setup and a whole process. And so you're probably going to try to group as many wines as you have ready around the same time on that same day or that same week, depending on how much and how long it's going to take. But if you do have your own setup, it's really cool because if something's ready early April and then something else is ready a few weeks later, like you could literally, if you have the staff, just bottle kind of whenever that wine is perfectly at the right spot.
And I mean, I guess we do hand bottle all of our sparkling wines too.
Yes.
So it's not a either or, right? You can use multiple approaches for all these things.
Yeah. But our white wine we use in truck.
But the bottling truck normally, but at bottling is actually oftentimes the chance, as we discussed, for like one last filtration for a lot of people, and that is like if you will cross flow that wine a day or two, a couple days before. Cross flow will get that down to near sterile, anyways. Very, very clear, very clean, filtered out certainly all the yeast and almost all potential bacteria. Bacteria aren't always bad. I guess I should make sure that because Enococcus, the bacteria that is doing your malolactic fermentation, that's definitely something you need. But there are bad bacteria too, particularly Acetobacter. That's what turns wine ultimately into vinegar. You want to. This will filter all those things out as well. It'll filter out any Brettanomyces, like you mentioned, which is actually much larger than bacteria. But anyways, so you've gone through the cross-flow step, and you normally have an inline sterile filtration, if that's the case, on your way to the bottle, so that the wine is, 0.4 micron, like totally gets everything filtered out. That is a common way, particularly if you're bottling a wine with residual sugar, which could just be certainly like a dessert style wine, but increasingly, there are white wines and even red wines where people might want to leave some sugar because everyone loves sugar, even if you don't realize. And when we mean sugar, the wines might not even appear sweet. This could just be small amounts, very small, almost subdetectable to your palate amounts of sugar, but that will add like a sweetness, but like certainly a richness to those wines. And so sometimes people might change. That could be one other last minute change that people do. They might add sweetness in some way to a wine to flesh it out. Of course, we do not do that here at Troon, but that is one other thing that could be done, and that would definitely be a reason why you would do sterile filtration, or as Micah mentioned before, Velcorin.
Yeah. And all of these basically are just ensuring that when your wine is in bottle, there's nothing alive eating something, creating something else. So there's no activity in your bottle. And I want to be clear about that because I mentioned Brett. It's like you'll still get the taste of it, right? Something could have happened in that wine before it went into bottle, but it's not still active, because then you will have an issue and possibly exploding bottles in your storage.
Speaking of exploding bottles, actually, the one last thing that can also be done in line at bottling is forced carbonation.
Chris is doing it before.
Yep, yeah, because we're talking about white wines specifically here, but a kind of easy button for making sparkling wines recently has been the advent of inline forced carbonation during bottling. So you can. And this is pretty common for certainly a lot of sparkling wines in cans are almost always done this way. But there even some wines that might look like they were bottle fermented can be forced carbonated. So it's a much faster process. You just have to have any white wine. Generally, you'll want to have again some sweetness into that, because many sparkling wines have some amount of residual sugar in it. At Troon, ours generally do not, because they bottle ferment to complete dryness, and we do not add back any dosage to any of our sparkling wines. So we do not add back sugar to that process. But yeah, the forced carbonation makes those wines more affordable, because it happens immediately, whereas bottle conditioning, bottle fermentation takes months or years depending on the process. So that is an option that some winemakers do use, is this forced carbonation of to create a sparkling wine from a white wine, for example, at the point of bottling.
Yeah. And so that takes us through bottling. So just to kind of go back and review very quickly, here were your steps that you learned because of the quiz that comes later. No. We start with harvest. Then you have your fruit intake at the winery. You are going to go through fruit processing, which is most likely pressing, maybe a few other fun things thrown in there. Then once you have that juice pressed, it's going to settle. You'll rack off of the lees and take all of that juice through fermentation. You might also choose to take it through malolactic fermentation, and then you're going to go into an aging period in any vessel it may be in, have some management during that time, and then eventually you will start going through blending trials. You'll be tasting things, you will physically blend that wine, and then once that wine is a wine, you will possibly cold stabilize, heat stabilize, and then have many options to filter. And then you put it in bottle.
Yeah, so obviously you can see that there are just many options for getting something from grapes to wine. And our intention here at Troon is to try to minimize what happens in the cellar between those two steps, grapes and wine in a bottle. And, that is as done as we've kind of described, through kind of thoughtful intention, especially thinking upstream in this process as much as possible. Ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Really setting our conditions at the outset for success. Always knowing what we want out of each wine, or each grape, I should say, that we pick, what we're trying to do, what our intentions are for those grapes, for that final wine, and just addressing as much as we can in the vineyard, so that by the time harvest comes, those grapes are exactly what we need them to be, so that they can go through all of these winemaking steps with the minimal amount of manipulation of interventions from the winemaking team as possible.
Yeah, and I would even point out, for those of you who maybe this is the first time kind of learning what steps go into a white wine, whether you're low intervention or not, there are a lot of things to take into consideration. There's a lot of planning that happens. There's a lot of management, a lot of, cleaning practices to uphold. So whether your wine program involves these products and additives or not, there's a lot to take into consideration, a lot to understand, because again, if you do one thing, that maybe leads you to other options that are different than if you selected a different option to begin with. So a lot of work goes into wine, a lot of time and care. And so we've been able to create a really beautiful program here at Troon with Nate's vision and guidance, and just want to create a little more awareness about what goes into wine in general. So
yeah, because as we said, none of these things are on a wine label, right? Of the dozens, if not more, different additives and options that we laid out, you would never know that as a consumer, because none of that is ever on the bottle. It's very rarely even on like the tech sheets and things like that you can find. So that's why we are kind of encouraging people to ask questions about how their wine is made. Like, we think we are huge advocates of transparency in everything we do here, and we want you to know what it is you're getting, and you should feel that way about other wines that you're purchasing as well. So know to ask questions, just so you understand what the processes are. And again, it's not like all of these are bad and our process is better, but we definitely think that you should know what that is, so you can make an educated choice about what you're purchasing and why you're purchasing it. So
yeah, and understand intention, because sometimes there is intention on adding certain products, but we both drink all kinds of wine from a lot of different producers, and just like learning more about them and sharing ours.
Yeah. So this time we've been able to go through the white winemaking process. Just to pitch coming up, we want to also be able to walk you through the red winemaking process, which is similar but different. Many choices can be made there. I would probably say even more choices can be made in that process, as well as then just also detail explicitly what Troon's winemaking philosophy is and how we adhere to that. So thank you for joining us for this whirlwind tour of winemaking and both conventional and other options that can be made. And we hope you continue listening to this little, I guess, almost mini series that we're doing here over the next couple of podcasts. So, part 1 and 2, white winemaking, and then more to come.
We are happy to share this podcast from Troon Vineyard, a Demeter Biodynamic and Regenerative Organic certified winery in Oregon's Applegate Valley. We farm like the world depends on it by growing produce in our gardens and naturally crafting authentic wines. We will be sharing these in-depth podcasts several times a month. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website at troonvineyard.com and those of the Regenerative Organic Alliance at regenorganic.org and Demeter Biodynamics at demeter-usa.org. Thanks for sharing our voyage to regenerative agriculture with us.